today I'd like to address the issue of why the Crusades eventually failed. And when we say the Crusades in this case, we are talking specifically about the Crusades in the Holy Land. Because if we look at the Crusades as this broader general movement, the way historians look at it today and, the way that medieval people thought of it at the time, you've got a lot of success. The campaigns in Spain and Portugal, very successful long term. Sicily, if we look at that as a proto-crusade, very successful. The Baltic, totally changed the region, long-term consequences. Even the Albigensian Crusade, for all its ugliness, did achieve, its objectives. So, in general, we look at the Crusades and we are looking at a mostly successful movement, a mostly successful project. So it's kind of interesting that, in the case of the Holy Land, this is one of the few areas where the campaigns did not succeed long term. And of course, this is the theater that in the popular imagination is most associated with crusading. So when people think of the Crusades, they think of the Holy Land. So why were the Crusades not able to succeed in the Holy Land long term? Obviously, there was quite a bit of short-term success, depending on how we're defining long term. 2 centuries, there was a Crusader presence in the Holy Land. So to look at this issue, we're going to start off by reading a passage from Norman Cantor. This is his General History of the Middle Ages, Civilization of the Middle Ages. I think this is used as a textbook at times in various courses on the Middle Ages in college. So let's just read this little passage. This is from his summary about the Crusades. So Cantor says, "It was more a matter of lack of interest than of inability. There's no doubt that if at any time in the 12th and 13th centuries the total resources of the papacy and the European monarchies had been applied to the crusading movement, a crushing defeat could have been inflicted on the Muslim armies that encircled the Latin kingdom. The fact remains, however, that the leaders of Western society had many other more pressing interests, and the crusading movement, however worthy they deemed it in their public pronouncements, was to them a rather peripheral matter. Many of the kings and the great feudal princes of Western Europe took the cross during the 12th and 13th centuries, but only a fraction of them actually departed for the Holy Land." Okay, so I think this is a fairly fair assessment of the whole thing. I do think we have to be careful about that word he says, inspired, or lack of interest, is what he says. He says it was more a matter of lack of interest. I don't think it was a lack of interest in the Crusades. The Crusades were very interesting to people in the medieval Latin West at all levels of society. When the nobles were sitting around listening to troubadours, they were listening to songs and poetry that celebrated the Crusades. This was the heroism of the day. This was the idea, the ideal that really captured the imagination of people, rich and poor. I think for the nobles, this was inspiring to them. They did find this very inspiring. But the reality is that Europe's nobles were mostly concerned with more mundane things, with practical politics, their own territorial interests, that kind of thing. Christopher Tyerman says that crusading was always the next thing to get to. Okay, well, once we, finish this squabble with the King of France, then we'll go off and do the Crusades. Once we teach the Count of Flanders that he doesn't own this land, then we'll head off to the Holy Land and we'll win the Crusades. And I think even if we're looking at the papacy, toward the middle of the 13th century, the popes start calling crusades against their political enemies in Italy. So the popes even are getting distracted from this goal of holding the Holy Land. So I think this is the problem, is that the European powers never cooperated for a final decisive victory. Crusader armies were generally small. They were led, for the most part, by leaders with fairly temporary commitments. Usually 1 or 2 great powers would set off on crusade at a time. It might be the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of France, one season. The next time it's maybe some of the Italian powers. And the next time it's the King of England and maybe the Duke of whatever. And, you get my point. I mean, it was like these different campaigns going off at different times with fairly small armies that weren't really able to, just inflict overwhelming defeats on the Muslim powers in the region. So a couple of things we can look at here. Logistics. So obviously the Holy Land is quite remote from the rest of Latin Christendom. These were long distances that had to be traversed. Sometimes the journey itself is the thing that really made it impossible to win a victory, in the Holy Land itself. Like, look at Frederick Barbarossa. He set off during the Third Crusade with one of the largest Crusader armies in history. It was so large he could not transport it by ship. I think in total he had about 15,000 men or something like that. So he had to take the overland route. He had to march through the Byzantine Empire and the territory of the Seljuk Turks in Asia Minor. He spent the entire crusade fighting them and defeating them. He defeated them, but then once his army got to Syria, of course, the emperor himself died in an accident, and then his army was wiped out by disease once they got to Syria. So they never even made it to the Holy Land. Or, by the time the last few remnants of his army made it to Palestine, it was over. I mean, the army and its power had already been spent in this long, arduous process of getting through Asia Minor itself. So logistics, yeah. And shipping, in terms of shipping supplies, I have heard people who know what they're talking about argue that, actually the shipping was pretty effective. The Italians were really able to get supplies to the Eastern Levant pretty quickly. Okay, fair enough, but it is still an enormous process. And in terms of the scope of it, just the amount of troops and supplies you might want to transport, that in itself could be an issue. Once Cyprus was acquired, once Richard the Lionheart took control of Cyprus during the Third Crusade, that hugely improved things for shipping supplies and launching Crusader armies against Egypt and that sort of thing. But yeah, logistics was always a huge issue, especially compared to other theaters of crusading, like Spain. Much simpler logistics. Of course, you've got kingdoms right there. I think if we compare the Crusades in the Holy Land with some of the other theaters, we can get an idea of some of the issues here. So let's compare this to the Crusades in Spain and Portugal, for example. So for one thing, you've got far easier logistics. Obviously, the rest of Christendom is right behind you. On top of that, the crusading in Spain and Portugal was attached to the interests of powerful monarchs who never went home. So crusading in these regions in the Iberian Peninsula were led by the King of Portugal, the King of Castile, the King of Aragon. They had direct territorial interests in expanding south. So when Crusader armies would arrive from the north and join forces with these Spanish monarchs and their armies, they already had a default, overall leader who was very committed to the region and who was going to be there long term and had long-term plans for the region. So, yeah, I think this in itself it makes a dynamic that's far easier for long-term sustained conquests and taking over of territory. And also continuous colonization from the rest of Christendom. It was very easy for people to come from other parts of Christendom and settle in newly conquered territories to the south of these Spanish kingdoms. Like, for example, when Alfonso the Battler conquered Zaragoza and that entire region around Zaragoza, a lot of Christians were coming from other parts of Iberia and even from France and places like this to set up shop there to help add to the numbers, to help with this process of occupying and gradually transforming the region. You did have some of that with the Holy Land. There were people, even peasants, who came from the west to settle there, but the numbers were smaller and it was far more difficult to do that. So right there, we can see, why crusading in Spain and Portugal probably had considerable advantage in terms of long-term conquests as opposed to the Holy Land. In the late 13th century, the Pope asked the Templars to come up with a plan, some sort of vision for what would be required to finally, take control of the Holy Land, to defeat the Muslims who ruled the region. And basically, what the Templars came up with, they did pretty much come up with this idea of all or most of the European kings joining together for this decisive strike. You can read about this in Malcolm Barber's book, The New Knighthood, which I recommend all the time, obviously, on this channel. This is the best, history of the Knights Templar. He says over here on page 287, therefore asked the Pope to try to promote a large general expedition as soon as possible, involving the Lord Kings of France, England, Germany, Sicily, Spain, and the other lords of the land, great and small, whose hearts God might illuminate in that affair so pious and laudable. Transport should be provided by the Genoese, Venetians, and other maritime powers in the form of large carriers, which had a capacity 4 times that of a galley, but could be provided at only a third of the cost. And in terms of the numbers he talks about in here, it's like 15,000 knights, 40 to 50,000 infantry and archers. So, these were very large numbers for the Middle Ages. And he also talks about, this commitment of the various powers of Europe establishing garrison forces in the Holy Land and committing, to keeping them up and maintaining them. This would be a long-term thing. You can't just go in and win the big victories and occupy the territory and then everybody goes home. You have got to commit to fairly large numbers of people staying, fairly large garrisons being established. So I think this gives us an idea of why the Crusades weren't able to hold the Holy Land long term. So the real question then becomes, how did the Crusades succeed for as long as they did? You've got this situation where small Christian armies are defeating large Muslim armies and holding territory long term in a region that's very remote from the home front, if you will. So, the Crusades, they're quite remarkable. These are examples of really remarkable courage, tenacity, and fighting prowess on the part of the Latin Christians. We don't know what would have happened in a crusade in which the Crusaders and the Muslims were evenly matched. We don't have an example of that. What if Richard the Lionheart, for example, had an army as large as Saladin's? I think he probably would have wiped the floor with him even more than he did, because the fact is he did wipe the floor with him for the most part. He defeated him, repeatedly in battle, despite being overwhelmingly outnumbered in some cases. The Battle of Jaffa certainly overwhelmingly outnumbered. Arsuf at least outnumbered by 2 to 1, probably more. But on top of that, every crusade that arrived, your resources are mostly limited to the guys you've already got there. Of course, there may be some boats showing up now and then with reinforcements, but compare that to, say, Saladin's ability to pretty much endlessly reinforce his armies. He's got territory all through Syria, Egypt. The Third Crusade, I think, does show us a lot of the situation. You've got a competent leader. It's a small army, but they're still able to win considerable victories, to conquer territory when very much outnumbered. So I think this helps lend credence to the plan that Jacques de Molay came up with. The Templars had a lot of experience in the region. I think they were probably right about this. So just as Norman Cantor is telling us, this is what was needed. So having discussed that, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'd like to say a special shout out to Other Realm Productions and call attention to his YouTube channel. He made some of the video game footage that I used in my last video. I hope you guys enjoyed that. He's got a very cool YouTube channel. I'm going to link it down below. If you guys would please check that out, I would appreciate it. And I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. I'll talk to you soon.